stones remember. That is the unnerving truth no one tells you on the flight into the Holy Land. Gold-tipped domes and weather-worn walls look quiet, but they hum with contested memory. Scholars argue footnotes in conference halls, while inscriptions in limestone shrug with a kind of ancient confidence. You step into Jerusalem, and the centuries start pulling at your sleeves like determined children. Here comes David with a sling, Solomon with an architect's eye, Herod with a ruler's arrogance, priests and prophets, fishermen and tent makers, a rabbi from Nazareth who overturned more than money tables. The streets still carry the weight. In the heart of the city, one stack of ashlar tells a king-sized story. The Western Wall, the last visible retaining wall of the Temple Mount expansion under Herod the Great, cuts the skyline with a defiant calm. Herod's work began around 20 to 19 BCE, and he built big because he lived loud. Some blocks weigh hundreds of tons. One is known simply as the Western Stone, carried in textbooks and documentaries, like a celebrity at about 517 tons, by modern estimates. Modern engineers squint, shrug, and start sketching pulleys and oil-slicked sledges. The stones themselves do not bother with explanations. They sit, worn satin smooth where hands have pressed prayers for centuries. Walk the Western Wall tunnels, and the city peels back like layers of papyrus. Robinson's Arch and Wilson's Arch hang in the space between archaeology and imagination, where you can see the ghost outlines of staircases that once carried worshippers. The Temple Mount itself remains a lightning rod of faith and politics, layered with the gilded dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa complex, a sacred precinct for Muslims and Jews, and a place that forces historians to speak carefully. You stand in a corridor cut through time, eye to eye with chisel marks from the Second Temple period. The murmur in that stone is not superstition. It is a ledger of labor and devotion, hard-coded into the city. Move a few minutes south, and the terrain drops into a ridge that once was a long fortified finger pointing toward the Gihon Spring. The city of David is less postcard and more excavation pit, dirt under fingernails, and buckets of pottery sherds. This is the place where ancient Jerusalem first grew muscle. The Gihon and its channels kept the city alive when kings in the ancient world wanted to starve enemies and watch them fold. Hezekiah, the Judean king who stared down Assyria in the late 8th century BCE, had a water plant. His tunnel, 533 meters of hand-hewn zigzag, still lets you wade cold water ankle to thigh, like an easier-than-you-expected rite of passage. Somewhere in this tunnel, around 1880, kids found the Siloam inscription chiseled into the wall, telling how two digging crews hacked toward each other and met in the middle. You can still see the letters, formed with confident ancient strokes. It sounds like a progress report to posterity. Climb out of the tunnel and sunlight bounces off massive steps that were underwater and forgotten until 2004, when archaeologists Ronnie Reich and Eli Shukran uncovered a broad pool with differently sized steps that look oddly like an amphitheater for priests. This is the Pool of Siloam. In the New Testament, a man born blind washed here and walked away with eyes that finally reported color and contour. People still trace their fingers along the edges. The pool itself drapes the story with geometry, Herodian stone, the width of the plaza, the angle of the drain. You feel it in your bones. It fits the story with the kind of quiet precision that annoys skeptics. From there, a newly excavated stepped street rises like a slanted spine up toward the Temple Mount. Many call it the Pilgrimage Road. The stones are scored from thousands of sandaled feet. Pottery and coins pulled from the fill sit in museum drawers with dates stamped like hang tags from the reigns of Roman emperors. This is where markets shouted, pilgrims bargained, and someone told a story about a mustard seed that still chokes disbelief 20 centuries later. The city wakes all of it without even trying. Now the skyline flips, and the Mount of Olives lifts its jaw east of the old city, looking across the Kidron Valley like a watchman who refuses sleep. Graves cover the slope in a million chalk-white rectangles, a silent crowd awaiting the day the prophets described with language that makes modern poets blush. Cemeteries do not lie about hope. The mount remembers kings returning, and the city's eastern gate waiting, sealed in stone, a kind of dare to the future. On clear days, dust drifts from the Judean desert like a thin incense. The ridge line feels close enough to touch. You stand on the ridge, and the old city looks small enough to cup in your hands, but the stories crack volumes. Drop down the slope, and an ancient olive grove gathers its branches like a conspiracy of elders. The Garden of Gethsemane is smaller than you expect, and the trees look older than any number on paper. Carbon dating suggests many of the trunks grew from the roots of older trees, some perhaps a millennium past, descended from a much older orchard. The gnarled trunks carry the pose of witnesses. This is where Jesus prayed, until sweat fell like drops of blood, where soldiers and torches broke the stillness, where the slow machinery of arrest and trial lurched forward. The grove smells like crushed leaves and dust and candle wax from countless vigils. The Basilica of the Agony stands nearby, with a ceiling painted deep blue and studded with golden stars, a night sky held in place by stone. The place is not loud. It does not need to be. Inside the old city, alleys cinch tighter, market stalls close overhead, and the air stacks with spice and incense and a dozen languages. Then a church appears, not like a steepled postcard, but as a symphony of stone, smoke, and friction. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands on a site venerated since the days of Emperor Constantine, whose mother Helena visited in the early 4th century and identified the spot of crucifixion and burial. Roman engineers, after Hadrian had buried the area beneath the Forum and a temple to a pagan goddess, a practice that ironically protected the location. The Constantinian complex carved away the Roman fill and showcased a rock outcrop and a tomb. The current church is a palimpsest of centuries of rebuilding after fires and earthquakes. Crusader architecture woven into older masonry. You move from room to room, and the city tells you to pick a century. Within the church sits the edicule, a small shrine built over the tomb venerated as that of Jesus. In 2016, restoration teams carefully lifted the marble cladding, exposed a limestone burial bench, and resealed it with scientific teams running ground-penetrating radar and 3D scans, like a hospital exam for a patient whose age is counted in eras. Tradition layers this spot like varnish layers on a painting, and that tradition is not lightweight. Ancient pilgrims left graffiti in Greek and Latin, invoking Christ right here. The topography matches a 1st century quarry outside city walls that later became a garden and burial grounds. Calvary now sits within the church walls because the city expanded around it, like a cathedral swallowing a hill. Just north outside the Damascus Gate, a tranquil garden hosts an alternative tradition. The garden tomb was identified in the 19th century after explorers noticed a skull-like rock face nearby and a hillside tomb cut into bedrock. Green lawns, quiet benches, wine press remains, and a rolling stone groove set a tone of reflective simplicity that many visitors crave after the dense mystique of the Holy Sepulchre. Archaeologists point out that the tomb's style likely predates the 1st century by centuries, probably Iron Age. Though it may have been reused, the garden offers reverence without the tug-of-war of centuries of ecclesiastical ownership. One site shouts significance through age-old liturgy and incense. The other whispers through sunlight and olive shade. Both draw the heart. One of them likely encloses the historical place, and that is where the sources lean, south of Jerusalem's clog of alleys. The route to Bethlehem drops into fields that sound familiar even if you never saw them before. The Church of the Nativity sits over a cave, remembered since the 2nd century as the birthplace of Jesus. Helena again, and her son Constantine, marked it with a basilica in the 4th century, later replaced by Justinian in the 6th. Earthquakes, sieges, and a Persian invasion in 614 battered the region. Local tradition holds that the invaders spared the church after seeing a mosaic of magi dressed in Persian garments. Whether that detail carries the weight believed, the structure itself carries scars and mosaics older than any Western cathedral. The Grotto of the Nativity is a low-ceilinged cave with a silver star marking a focal point of more than devotion. Thousands stoop through the door of humility to enter the basilica, a door intentionally lowered in the Ottoman era to deter mounted intrusions. Star, candles, smoke stains, carved columns with crusader frescoes seeping through time. Every surface hosts memory. Travel north to the basin of hills that holds Nazareth like a cup. It felt small in the 1st century, a village of a few hundred with rock-cut silos and terrace fields. It feels crowded now with churches and traffic and pilgrims. The Basilica of the Annunciation stands over a legacy of ancient dwellings, one of which drew attention as a 1st century house preserved and later venerated. Archaeologist Ken Dark reported evidence of a domestic structure from that era, with signs of careful maintenance and later church construction atop it. Beneath the basilica, bedrock caves open to a gallery of archaeology that drips with history. Outside the church complex, another church marks the workshop of Joseph by tradition. A short drive across town, Nazareth Village reconstructs a 1st century agricultural terrace and carpenter's workspace. That living museum places agricultural tools and stone jars into your hands, rather than your imagination. Nazareth looks like a city now, but it still sits inside a ring of hills that keeps a rural whisper alive. The Sea of Galilee stretches like a palm leaf glistening in the sun, framed by basalt hills and air that hums with bees and boats. On the northern shore, the ruins of Capernaum lay out a street grid in black basalt. It does not look like a spiritual capital. It looks like a fishing town. Archaeologists uncovered a house that hosted a transformation of identity, gradually modified with plaster and graffiti invoking Jesus, with walls thickening through time, then swallowed by a 4th century octagonal church. Tradition ties it to Simon Peter's house. Whether the identification holds, a house in that town became a gathering place where a teacher healed a mother-in-law and sparked a movement that would not stay local. Across the street rises a white limestone synagogue, built in the 4th or 5th century, over basalt foundations that may mark an earlier synagogue. The grain of the stone screams import, because local basalt is dark and heavy, while the synagogue's ornate capitals and columns gleam with limestone likely ferried in from elsewhere. It is a civic statement in stone, born from a Jewish community, living in the Roman and Byzantine world without surrendering its soul. The shoreline still keeps fisher boats pulled onto black pebbles. Nearby in Kibbutz Ginosar, a 1st-century wooden boat nicknamed the Galilee Boat rests in a climate-controlled display, raised from the mud in 1986, carbon dated to the period of Jesus. It does not prove a name from any gospel, but it holds the smell of resin and salt and toil. The lake's chop slides under a thin hull the way it did then. Up on a curve of hillside lies the site long celebrated as the Mount of Beatitudes, a modern church designed in 1937 by Antonio Barluzzi, crowns the slope with an octagonal floor plan, hinting at 8 statements that redefined power as meekness. The hillside forms a natural amphitheater. Acoustic tests show a human voice can carry down the slope without amplification. A subtle nod from geology to theology. The view sweeps to the Golan and the Arbel Cliffs, the lake throwing diamond-slashed sunlight across water. The setting refuses to stage only one sermon. It stages the idea that ordinary ground can carry words that alter the coordinates of the world. Just south of Capernaum, 2009 brought an interruption to modern construction plans. In a town called Migdal, or Magdala, excavators uncovered a first-century synagogue, one of the earliest discovered in Galilee. At its center lay a carved stone featuring iconography that researchers likened to a depiction of the temple in miniature, with a menorah relief rare outside Jerusalem at that time. The discovery shifted assumptions about synagogues in the first century from mere prayer halls to spaces of reading, discussion, and community life anchored in tangible symbols. The site also yielded mikviyot, stepped ritual baths, fed by groundwater, pristine and symmetrical like stone thoughts. Magdala was the hometown of a follower named Mary, called Magdalene. Her hometown's archaeology refuses hagiography and still ends up bolstering a very human connection to the story's edges. The lake licks the shore, less a backdrop than a participant in the narrative. Follow the river down from the lake, and a muddy, olive-banked crossing takes center stage. Two main baptism sites on the Jordan River pull visitors into the current of a story that stubbornly resists becoming only metaphor. Qasr al-Yahud, on the West Bank side near Jericho, opened access again in 2011 after decades of restrictions. A monastery complex sits nearby. The water runs brown and warm. Churches from different traditions raise their crosses where the river narrows. On the East Bank, Al-Maktas in Jordan received UNESCO World Heritage status in 2015 for a cluster of early church ruins, baptismal pools, and pilgrim inscriptions that point to centuries of veneration as the place where John baptized and where Jesus stepped into the water. Archaeology at Al-Maktas reveals remains of a 5th-century church and a cruciform baptismal pool fed by the river. The floodplain shifts, and the river's exact course has wandered over centuries. But the cluster of ancient commemoration is not coy. The argument here is not whether something happened. The argument is where exactly the water met the script of history. Pilgrims in white robes file down into the water, the sound of singing braided with camera shutters and the slap of silt on skin. Northwest of the river crossing rises a site that once reduced every invading army to a math problem. Jericho, specifically Tel Es Sultan, tells a story in layers of mud bricks and collapsed walls. Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s concluded that the destruction layer of the city she labeled City 5 dates to around 1500 and 550 BCE, earlier than many conservative chronologies for the Israelite conquest. That conclusion led entire generations of textbooks to wave off the Jericho account as anachronistic. Later, archaeologist Bryant Wood argued that Kenyon's pottery chronology underestimated certain Canaanite forms, and that City 4's destruction better aligns with a date around 1400 BCE. The site refuses simple answers. Radiocarbon samples, ceramic typologies, and stratigraphy all enter the ring. The debate becomes more than one city's timeline. It becomes a case study in how evidence yields to method. A spring bubbles near the mound, tied in later tradition to Elisha. Palm trees sprout everywhere. Jericho doesn't apologize for its age, or for its irritation factor. The mound itself looks unimpressed with anyone's theory. A few miles south of Jericho, rock bluffs crouch above a hungry blue field of water. The Dead Sea looks like a body of water from another planet, heavy with minerals and light bending in odd ways. On the northern shore, limestone cliffs hide a lattice of caves. In 1947, Arab shepherds tossed a stone into one and heard a shattering thud, not the hollow echo they expected. Inside lay clay jars and a cache of ancient scrolls that would shape biblical studies for the rest of the century. The Dead Sea Scrolls unfurled Hebrew texts that matched and sometimes predated by a millennium the Masoretic manuscripts used in modern Bibles. The great Isaiah scroll stretches more than 7 meters, captured on high-resolution digital images showing an 8th century BCE prophet's words preserved on 2nd century BCE parchment with spellings that echo the later text astonishingly. Roland de Vaux directed early excavations at Qumran settlement, proposing an Essene community of celibate, ritual-bathing ascetics who copied scrolls by lamplight, then hid them when the Roman legions marched. Later scholars challenged parts of that reconstruction, arguing for a more complex relationship between the settlement and the scrolls. The caves and the texts keep the debate alive, while the ink on those parchments refuses to fade in relevance. Head west into a wadi named for wild goats and hidden springs. En-Gedi looks like an oasis sketched by a poet. Waterfalls step down limestone ledges into pools where ibex drink and children laugh. Somewhere in these ravines, a hunted shepherd named David cut Saul's robe and turned down a quick path to a crown in exchange for a longer, harder story. The topography explains the choice. The cliffs provide sightlines that preempt ambush, and the caves hide a dozen men and their supplies. In the late Roman period, a synagogue at En-Gedi yielded a mosaic with a strange inscription pronouncing a curse on those who would reveal the town's secret, possibly linked to balsam, a lucrative plant resin grown in the area and guarded like a state secret. The mosaic glows with geometric patterns and biblical symbols. The wadi hums in cicadas and calls the past closer. Farther north into the center of the land, a hill called Shiloh looks less dramatic than its legacy. After Joshua divided the land, the tabernacle found a home here, and here a child named Samuel first heard a call in the night. Excavations at Shiloh over the years, including work by Israel Finkelstein in the 1980s, and more recently by Scott Stripling and colleagues, unearthed large storage jars, evidence of feasting animals with butcher marks consistent with sacrificial meals, and fortification walls of the Iron Age. Researchers debate the exact footprint of the tabernacle and whether a rectangular flat area on the northern summit could have hosted a tent sanctuary. Sometimes the lack of an obvious stone temple feels like a failure. The story at Shiloh was always portable, skin of a tent rather than skin of a wall. The ground holds pottery, ash layers, pomegranate decorations crafted in clay, and bones that hint at worship practices. The site whispers a memory of a nation assembling and a priesthood wearing thin under the weight of corruption before a boy's prophetic word recentered the compass. The southern Sinai beckons with a barren beauty that strips pretense. The desert does not pretend to care about your phone signal. It cares whether you packed water. At the foot of a mountain locally known as Jebel Musa sits a monastery that feels like an ark of stone. St. Catherine's Monastery preserves manuscripts, icons, and a tradition that links this massif to the mountain where Moses received the law. Pilgrims have climbed the summit for centuries to watch sunrise flame over a landscape shaped by wind and time. The monastery stands near a bush venerated as a descendant of the plant that burned with fire yet was not consumed. The icon collection inside the monastery includes some of the oldest surviving Christian art in the world, protected by dry air, remote location, and continuous Christian presence through empires that rose and fell. Some researchers in the past century argued for an alternative location for Sinai in northwestern Arabia, pointing to Jebel al-Lawz. Proponents claim altars, boundary markers, and other features align with an Exodus itinerary. Mainstream scholarship pushes back, noting problems with the epigraphic and archaeological claims and the lack of secure dating. The landscape carries the debate without taking sides, its granite domes dropping shadows over valleys that run like veins. Whether you stand on Jebel Musa under a sky that looks close enough to touch, or scan the slopes of Saudi peaks under a permit and a long drive, the severity of the place jolts the story out of children's book tones and into a narrative of survival, dislocation, and encounter. The Sinai never stops being a test. Cross the Jordan's high plateau into a view that uncoils a map at your feet. Mount Nebo looks west across the lower Jordan Valley, the Dead Sea slick and metallic, Jericho a smear of green, and beyond it, the hill country of Benjamin and Judah, the spine of a land promised and worth lamenting. A serpent-like bronze sculpture twists above the breezes, near a church built first in the 4th or 5th century and rebuilt and restored in the modern era. Mosaics pattern the floor with hunting scenes, vines, and geometric shapes, unrolling color like a scroll. Moses died here according to Deuteronomy, and the text insists his burial place remains unknown, a divine refusal to let the people fossilize the story around a shrine. The Madaba map, a 6th century mosaic map found in a church not far from here, depicts Jerusalem and the region with symbols that remind you ancient Christians made maps with love rather than bitterness. The view from Nebo makes easy slogans look cheap. The landscape carries weight that demands more than tourist snapshots and quick captions. Then the road runs north by northwest, out of the Levant across to Asia Minor, where marble-streeted Ephesus sprawls in elegant ruins under the watch of hills and a sky often empty of clouds. This city was the 1st century capital of Roman Asia. The theater seats about 24,000 and wraps around sound like a hand cupped to amplify a riot. Under that open sky, craftsmen stirred a crowd against a growing movement that threatened their livelihoods tied to shrines and silver images. The excavation team, long coordinated by the Austrian Archaeological Institute, has peeled back layers of homes called terrace houses with frescoes that pulse with pigment, mosaics that swirl fish and borders underfoot, and inscriptions that name officials and benefactors who bought influence in Roman letters. Paul lived here for 2 to 3 years in the early 50s CE by most reconstructions, and probably wrote letters that form large segments of the New Testament from this city or nearby. The library facade of Celsus rises like a stone, bookshelf turned inside out, its reconstructed columns framing a wisdom that reads more like advertisement now than learning. The Temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the ancient world, is a field of stumps and reeds, but its ancient cultic gravity still tugs at imagination. The Revelation letter to the church in Ephesus calls to mind a community that worked hard, but lost a spark it once carried like wildfire. Walking the curate street at sunset, your feet slide over marble grooves worn by chariots and sandals, and the visuals stop being just scenic. Ephesus is a mirror. Jerusalem pulls you back for unfinished business because that city never lets you leave without at least one more turn. The Pool of Bethesda, near the Lion's Gate in the Muslim Quarter, reveals a tangle of Roman and Byzantine ruins, where Crusader builders raised a church over an earlier basilica over layers of ritual baths and water channels. Texts describe a man lame for decades healed by a word at a pool lined with colonnades. The archaeology shows a series of pools with steps and porticos, a Thermae-like complex that morphed through time as Romans absorbed local habits and Christians rededicated spaces. St. Anne's Church, a 12th century structure blessed with acoustics so clean that a single voice sounds like a choir, sits above. The stone retains a memory of water, a scent of dampness under the sun-baked city. Westward again, a valley north of Jerusalem, called Megiddo, would deserve a place on any list, simply for its layered gates and stables and water systems. Tel Megiddo inspired a Greek mashup word, Armageddon, in the apocalyptic imagination. While the Book of Revelation speaks in symbol and vision, the Tel itself holds Bronze and Iron Age fortifications, a 9th century BCE gate complex often linked to Omride or Solomonic constructions, depending on how one reads the dates and gate plans, and a tunnel that allowed water access without exposure. The Jezreel Valley spreads around it like a bowl where armies on chariots could roll in fast. Archaeological stratigraphy here has taught generations of students how to read layers. The site looks like a lesson plan built in soil and stone, cut back through the mountains to Hebron's ancient valley, and Beersheba's wells and Shechem's shoulder between Mounts Gerizim and Ebal, and the map turns into a geography of covenant echoes. Jacob's well near Nablus sits beneath a Byzantine and later church, where water still drops cold and clear from the dark. The gospel scene of an itinerant master speaking with a Samaritan woman draws oxygen from this well's depth. The site itself has undergone damage and restoration through modern conflict, which only underscores how contested memory remains in this part of the world. Stones survive gunfire with a kind of stubbornness that people sometimes forget to imitate. The coastline of the Mediterranean then calls with a different rhythm. Caesarea Maritima, Herod the Great's port city, locks the sea into a man-made harbor, where Roman engineering once defied physics with cement that cures underwater. Josephus described the project with admiration bordering on awe, and modern divers still find traces of hydraulic concrete in the surf. The city's theater, hippodrome, and aqueduct tell a story of a Judean coastline transformed into a Roman postcard. This is where a centurion named Cornelius and a fisherman from Galilee changed the trajectory of a movement by crossing a boundary others considered hardwired. It is also the city where Paul stood in chains to speak before Roman governors and a client king, and where Luke sets scenes with precision that archaeologists keep tripping over like markers placed to prove he walked the plazas. A slab bearing the name Pontius Pilate was found here in 1961, a dedication that anchored a name usually set only on parchment into stone. You walk the promenade, and the waves rush in like applause. On the cliffs above the Dead Sea, the desert sun takes pity only in late afternoon. Qasr al-Yahud's reeds whisper, but the day belongs to stone. Qumran's plateau looks like a lunar module landed on Earth and decided to build with chalk. The scribe's life work here, and in caves, might have been interrupted by the 10th Roman legion's advance during the First Jewish Revolt in 68 CE. Those archives slipped into caves wrapped in linen, safe as any ancient text can be. Museum cases around the world now argue with their labels, because when a 2nd century BCE Isaiah matches a medieval text letter for letter enough to call them kin, the argument stops about whether scribes cared about accuracy. They did, and the parchment knows it. Ein Gedi's Wadi insists on rest, footholds cut into limestone, led up to hidden caves, like air-conditioned rooms. Hikers splash water on their necks, and suddenly the desert feels like a friend rather than a dare. David's restraint in that cave reads differently with water on your face. That inscription in the later synagogue pronouncing a curse on anyone revealing the town's secret catches in the brain. Locals protected a trade in balsam, a resin treasured for perfume and medicine, the ancient world priced scent like gold. The location guarded it better than any army. Shiloh still refuses to perform theatrics. Evidence accumulates like a measured drumbeat rather than a cymbal crash. Storage jar handles, pomegranate motifs. Faunal remains analyzed to distinguish butchery patterns consistent with sacrificial practice. Fortification lines with collapsed stones depressed into a hillside like the aftermath of a slow disaster. The geography of Shiloh slots into a crossroads of tribal allotments, and sometimes geography matters more than politics. People have gathered in that hollow for decisions that drew lines generations could not easily erase. The desert opens its hand and releases you back to the spine of roads where caravans once chewed dust for profit. South again, and then west. The Sinai draws a straight line into contemplation. Jebel Musa stands with a huddle of smaller peaks as if mountains practiced monasticism. The trek up begins in the dark, for many a line of headlamps tracing switchbacks, called the Steps of Repentance in later monastic lore. At the top, wind races across granite and presses clothing flat against your frame. Sunrise throws gold across the valley and reveals jagged contours like broken teeth. The summit's small chapel squeezes dozens into a space built more from intention than from comfort. Monks at St. Catherine's never stopped ringing bells, even when empires changed their flags. The murmured argument over Sinai's location, across borders and centuries, has never slowed the conviction of those who pray on Jebel Musa, or those who show photographs of blackened rocks in Arabia and argue for a different mountain. The debate belongs to both geography and hermeneutics, maps, and meaning. Meanwhile, pilgrims of every shade of confidence climb and climb, because something about a mountain with covenant echoes refuses to sit in a book and behave. Mount Nebo then offers a goodbye to one narrative and a hello to another. The smell of time and dust rides the wind. The view picks up Jericho's green stripe and runs across to Jerusalem, as if a finger traced a path on a relief map. The church's mosaics refer you to a vision of abundance, while your eye looks down into a land contested by swords and charters and olive harvests. The two things, mosaic plenty and lived tension, refuse to cancel each other. Both are true. The staff and serpent sculpture lines up two stories from the Torah and the Gospels and frames them in metal that whistles in the wind. It does not reduce complexity. It lifts it. Then the imagination crosses to Ephesus again for one more pass at its bright marble underfoot. The baths and latrines, the fountains with inscriptions to emperors, the putti and dolphins immortalized in stone, all tell you this was a city that loved show and order, patrons and prestige. The great theater sits like an ear, listening to the centuries. Modern production stage operas there. Tourists pose in the center of the stage to test the acoustics. The stone steps answer every syllable. The terrace houses with their elaborate wall paintings reveal layouts with atriums and peristyles and private shrines tucked behind columns. You can see where servants moved and where owners reclined. You can smell plaster and dust while imagining cinnamon and wine. This city choked on its incense of power and piety, and the letters written to it still insist on love as a motive stronger than platform or program. Ephesus puts you in the race of life with a stadium seat you can touch. Back in Jerusalem, the western wall's shadows lengthen as the city repeats its daily liturgy of sunset. For some, the stones represent centuries of loss and longing. For others, a visible connection to presence and promise. The tunnel's cool air touches the face like breath from a different century. In the city of David, archaeology continues under protective tents and careful supervision, raising buckets and lowering expectations while occasionally pulling up a find that forces textbooks to revise sentences. The pool of Siloam's excavated steps, wide and stepped in alternating widths, challenge anyone who has ever accused faith of avoiding evidence. Remains of paving stones from the pilgrimage road trap coins, stamped with imperial profiles in their mortar. Names like Herod Agrippa and Pontius Pilate leap from stone to ink, like a magician's reveal. The Mount of Olives continues to watch, its eastern slopes dotted with tomb entrances cut into limestone like eyes. The Garden of Gethsemane's olive leaves flicker silver green in twilight, a color that insists life continues after betrayals and decrees. Inside the Holy Sepulchre, the rhythmic chanting of different traditions intertwines and sometimes collides, reminding that faith communities can be both family and rival. The Eticule glows like a hearth in a stone labyrinth. In the garden tomb's quiet, birds ping their music off stone, and the hill's alleged skull face shows cracks and collapse from centuries of erosion and quarrying. A reminder that symbolism and geology do not always coordinate schedules. Bethlehem's star sits low in a grotto, where stone worn smooth by knees tells you devotion shaped the rock as surely as pickaxes. Nazareth hums with traffic, while a subterranean world under the basilica keeps its dark cool, protecting walls from the first century that smell of damp chalk. Capernaum's basalt pads the feet with a reliable roughness. The synagogue's white stone lifts the gaze. The Mount of Beatitudes keeps its birdsong and its hillside acoustics. Magdala's synagogue sits with the quiet conviction of new evidence that refuses to be tamed by old categories. The Jordan River pulls cloth and hair with a gentle insistence that water does. People dress in white robes and step down murky steps into a ritual both ancient and remade. Jericho's tell bakes in sun and argument. Qumran frames the Dead Sea's strange metallic surface, while museums far away hum with climate control to keep skin of parchment from turning to dust. Ein-Gedi's waterfalls never stop. Shiloh's hill collects pottery like a teacher collects assignments. Sinai's stone holds silence that does not negotiate. Nebo's view makes you taller from the inside. Ephesus fills the lungs with a different empire's air, and still insists the New Testament is not an abstract. Every one of these places refuses to stay on the page. They recruit senses and ask for decisions. They hold the hush of sanctuaries and the scrape of trowels, the cry of a muezzin and a rabbi's chant, the whistle of wind on a ridge and the shuffle of thousands of shoes. Evidence, tradition, and experience meet in these coordinates and collide or embrace. Calendars keep rolling forward. Debates grow new leaves each season. Excavations halt and resume. Funding ebbs and flows, but the stones do not pack up and leave. They wait with unembarrassed patience. Visit the Western Wall and your fingers fill with grit that carries the DNA of multiple empires. Walk the tunnel and your calf muscles talk back, while your mind calculates dates without even trying. Trace the city of David's bedrock ridges and learn to respect topography as destiny. Stand under the olive trees in Gethsemane and let their twisted trunks teach you something about resilience. Let incense sting your eyes in the Holy Sepulchre and allow the complexities of tradition to test your simplicity. Step into the garden tomb's empty doorway and feel the power of silence in an age that loves noise. Kneel at Bethlehem's star in a cave where centuries have polished stone into velvet. Let Nazareth tell you that small places anchor large stories. Eat a fish lunch on the lakeshore and remember that people live on practicality, not slogans. Listen to your echo in the Capernaum synagogue and imagine debates that were loud and sacred at once. Drift the Jordan's current a few steps and feel ancient water tug at your ankles. Squint at Jericho's layers until you see the patience required to argue well. Read a fragment of Isaiah in a museum and notice your shoulders straighten. Splash water on your face at Ein-Gedi and hear the story of restraint whisper with the falls. Stand in Shiloh's dust and accept that holiness sometimes comes in drab packaging. Climb Sinai by headlamp and let hunger sharpen rather than dull your attention. Stand on Nebo and allow the ache of unfinished hopes to be honorable. Walk between Ephesus's columns and understand that cities teach theology simply by the width of their streets and the weight of their stones. This is how 18 places breathe. This is how geography talks back. This is how the Bible stops pretending to be only ink and becomes coordinates strong enough to carry you.